The Russians were sent to fight against the Ukrainians in the trenches and in the ruins of the cities of Kharkiv. The defenders positioned themselves, trying to survive the waves of small groups of Russians sent against them. In addition, planes flew over Kharkiv, dropping bombs on the forces of Kiev. The Ukrainians defended themselves with drones that chased the Russians among the ruins. In the midst of this, two officers from the 128th Russian Brigade were fighting each other. The decisions and worries in a man's soul sometimes come together to weave the final threads of his fate. This happens both for good and for bad, when many times the paths of soldiers and officers are joined by war, creating the conditions for glory, or a forgotten corpse on the battlefield. Russian officers Anton Nesherda and Sergei Filipchuk met at the Belgorod border with Kharkiv. Still in 2001, 2024, and after that, there would be a conflict between two generations that would mark their lives. The Russian advance through Kharkiv began with a success that delighted the eyes of the officer. Ukrainian tanks burned on the road when they tried to fight back. Russian kamikazes flew against the sparse Ukrainian defenses in the region, filling the soldiers with panic. In a place they thought would be a quiet position in the war, men like Colonel Anton Nesherda saw an opportunity to shine. Nesherda knew that the Russian Su-25s were taking off from air bases like Butyurilovka or Voronezh-Malchivo, making their ascent in Russian skies. Then they would cross the Ukrainian border, do follow flights over enemy trenches, bombing defenders, and clearing the way for troops like the 128th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade. Colonel Nesherda watched the combat videos with a smile, like the Ukrainian armored vehicles exploding on mines, or when they tried to move in to attack the Russians and were hit and forced to retreat. The bombs started falling on buildings in cities like Vovchansk. The kamikazes hit the trenches around the city. Surrounded by the explosions' fire, the soldiers were forced to flee. The Russian lancers watched sadistically, plotting the explosions that would kill the men hiding in the forest around Vovchansk. A stray soldier trying to survive the Russian advance would soon also be taken out by the kamikazes. Everything seemed fine for Nesherda until the Ukrainians regrouped and started sending their drones into the carnage. Death danced at a ball where the guests of honor were Russian souls. The desperate ones fired at the drones, but fear didn't help them hit the demons or make them pay the price of war. Some of them didn't even make it to Vovchansk, dying on the outskirts of the city from the kamikaze attacks. There was nowhere to hide. Stuck on the banks of rivers they were supposed to cross, some of them fired at the threat that dove toward them. The end result was a wounded man drowning in red waters. Then, the front turned into a stalemate where the Ukrainians didn't seem as concerned about advancing in many areas, but just watching how men like Colonel sent their new recruits through the city's rubble for over a year. That would become the standard pattern. Russians trying to advance, Ukrainians defending themselves, men dying on all sides. Nesherda kept fulfilling his role, sending his men on missions, with a selection process whose criteria left many people fooled. Somehow, Sergei Filipchuk decided to interfere. Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade had some of the toughest missions of the war, trying to solve problems on a front where his compatriots were almost always at a disadvantage. That day, their machine guns, rifles, and grenades would have to deal with two Russians who were trying to advance along a tree line. Coordination with the drone was important to keep them aware of the approaching danger.
Leaving the bunker was always calculated to shoot at them.
The shots fired at the Russians hit the trees or the ground. The enemy soldiers tried to take cover. Then, the suppressive fire gave the Ukrainians a chance to come out and throw grenades. No matter how much the Russians tried to advance, the coordination between the drone and the defenders was too skillful to allow them to leave the trench where they had taken cover. The successive shots whizzed right past them until at some point they made the mistake of trying to advance. The drone alerted the Ukrainians and had them open fire even through the bunker mound. It alerted the Ukrainians. One of the soldiers from the 3rd Brigade threw the grenade. That was the final blow against the Russians in that battle. Attacks like that didn't seem to make sense to many, but it was part of the Russians' routine, sending those small assault groups against small and worn-out squads that defended the Ukrainian positions. He said he was just following those orders when he learned that Filipchuk was in the Belgorod region and started hearing about the matter. The interference of the old man who came out of retirement in the work of the young colonel would create deadly friction in the 120th Brigade. While the officers were starting to trade barbs, Russian bombs were flying to destroy various parts of Vovchansk. The explosions brought concrete down on the Ukrainians' heads. There were so many in a row that the soldiers didn't even have time to leave their hiding places. The Russians' targets were not only the men, but also the Ukrainian artillery hidden among the trees with the 152mm 2S3 self-propelled gun. The drone attacks destroyed the equipment and ammunition hidden in the forest. The Russian kamikaze drones flew over Vovchansk, searching for the Ukrainians who moved along the edges of the city, still under Kiev's control. One of these drones, Molinha, was a fixed-wing first-person view drone that could fly an average distance of up to 50 kilometers. However, the Vovchansk distance plane crashed onto a pickup truck. The soldiers quickly got out of the vehicle, still dazed, but all alive, despite the heavy detonation impact from the drone's warhead. After so many explosives were dropped on the Ukrainians, Russian 128th Brigade officers like Nesherda sent more men to Vovchansk. Anton Nesherda had his own way of dealing with soldiers who refused to go on missions. One of them was beating. Although other incidents had been reported within the Russian armed forces, Nesherda was quite efficient in this process. His men suffered from excessive punishments, which involved physical and psychological torture. Of course, it didn't always get to the point of a soldier being dragged across the field, tied to a car, used his imagination during punishments. Anyone who didn't want to go on assaults had to pay, and pay dearly. The soldier's salary was the morbid sustenance of his life. It was either pay up or be sent on the worst assaults. In Vovchansk, these small Russian squads roamed the ruins of the city with the goal of occupying destroyed houses and buildings to expand their territory. The Ukrainians waited for them with their rifles aimed, starting with shots that took them down one by one on the battlefield. The Russians heard their comrades up ahead scream as they fell. They kept running, aware that they would probably be the next to kiss the Ukrainian soil. The defenders of Kyiv emerged from the ruins, squeezing their triggers, while the Russians tried to take cover, still taken by surprise. What the rifle didn't kill, the grenade finished off. The rifles of the 34th Separate Motorized Infantry Battalion were active in these defenses against the Russian troops, such as the 128th Brigade. They relied on drone support to try to prevent enemy soldiers from getting too close, easing the pressure. The 34th Battalion was a unit of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, which was formed in 2014 when it was still called the Batik-Vyshinya Volunteer Territorial Defense Battalion.
Already in 2025,
He was known as Wolfhound and served under the command of the 57th Motorized Infantry Brigade, which provided support with drones. The drones didn't always work, so the rifles had to be ready to take down the enemies. Many of them wandered alone through the ruins after their squads were taken out by explosions from the air. Many of these soldiers couldn't even tell where the shot that took them down came from, and they walked over the wreckage of wolfhounds, following orders until they witnessed the blood spurting from their wounded comrades. In those moments, there was no war philosophy or strategy, only a few seconds to die or try to find cover. Their bodies piled up. Some, too wounded to move in places where evacuation was impossible, made desperate choices about their lives. The deaths of these soldiers were a constant and very well known to officers like Anton Nesherda. They kept being sent, especially those who didn't give in to extortion by their comrades. They were brought down by incoming explosions. A drone dropped a grenade on one of them. The man still crawled among the rubble, bleeding over what was left of Ukrainian homes and families. All the soldier thought about at that moment was the need to survive and the luck that the drone didn't have another grenade to end his life. His comrade waited for him and called him to the only place where they could protect themselves until the next wave and gather enough numbers to test the Ukrainian troops. But then, the man's strength was gone. He fell in front of the hideout, rolling inside with his eyes closed, while his comrade winced. So there wouldn't be just a corpse or a wounded man who would soon die in there.
reaching a shelter was no guarantee of survival.
Soldiers from the 34th Battalion placed explosives in buildings with already exposed structures. On certain occasions, they resorted to using anti-tank mines to bury the Russians under the rubble of those improvised bunkers. There was another risk, even though the Russians suffered from it, but they weren't very used to it. The Ukrainian MiG-29s prepared for their airstrikes. Kharkiv had efficient glide bombs provided by countries like France, although they weren't widely used, since Russian factories were important in the fighting for the Ukrainian side. Flew their missions, dropping the glide bombs. The explosion brought down the Russian positions. Sometimes, those were spots where their squads had taken shelter and set up to continue their attacks. Sergei Filipchuk, while passing through Belgorod, was gathering more and more material to use as evidence against Colonel Nesherda. One of the cases that caught attention was that of Lieutenant Matveev, who was tied up and taken into the forest in the Shibikino district in the Belgorod region. There, they tied him to a tree with duct tape and began to beat him brutally. The torture lasted nearly all night. Filipchuk, a long-serving armed forces member, had already retired, and now, coming back for Putin's special operation, he couldn't stand to see Russian soldiers reduced to this. The Russians continued their attacks against the Ukrainians. Their drones flew near Vovchansk, trying to prevent Kyiv's forces from resupplying their troops, blocking supply routes in Abos, as well as depleting the defenders' ammunition stock, allowed them to pursue the soldiers in those vehicles, eliminating more enemies in the process. Russian kamikaze drones
and artillery operated inside Vovchansk to ensure that Ukrainian hideouts were destroyed, making it easier for their soldiers to advance. This would also prevent men like Colonel Nesherda from sending their subordinates to certain death. So many strikes against the structures forced the Ukrainians to move from one shelter to another. This rush was a problem because often important items were left behind in the rubble, like ammunition or food. To make matters worse, when they arrived at a new shelter, a Russian kamikaze drone was already flying in to blow them up. The Russians were thus able to reach trenches where they could defend themselves. Sometimes they tried to have some fun along the way, but there they would find the bodies of their comrades who had arrived before them.
The reason they found the remains of their compatriots was in the sky, in the swarms of Ukrainian drones that were simply waiting for them.
Sergei Filipchuk wanted to save those soldiers, but he was from a time of war without drones, still trying to understand what the war had become.
The wear and tear of those new times showed on his body. Thin and tired, he found himself facing a challenge when he came across information about Colonel Nesherda's troops. Born on October 24, 1966 in Balt, which was still the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic at the time. He graduated in 1986 from the Olympic Reserve Sports School in Chisinau, and in the same year he entered the Sevastopol Higher Naval Engineering School. He completed his studies in 1991 as a lieutenant and served in the Northern Fleet. On surface ships and submarines, he served on the nuclear submarines K5-132 Vepr and K461 Volk. Advancing in his career, he became deputy commander, responsible for educational work, participating in 2 combat detachments and missile tests. Discharged in 2007 with the rank of second-class captain, he received several medals and the badge for brave service in the Arctic. In March 2024, motivated by patriotic duty, he voluntarily returned to active service, being appointed Deputy Politico-Military Commander in the newly formed military district. There, he began working with the 128th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 44th Corps, responsible for political military work. This was what brought him into contact with the men under the command of Colonel Anton Nesherda. He gathered evidence for months, but knew that a trial would take too long and would allow Nesherda to commit more crimes. Filipchuk decided to challenge the other officer in the hope of sparing Zeta. He was not afraid of Nesherda's influence, who, by the way, had a brother who was a deputy commander in the 4th Tank Division. It was an absurd mistake by a man used to the old structure and with too much confidence in military honor. Nesherda asked the chief of staff of the brigade, Lieutenant Colonel Zadnov, for help. The latter prepared an individual combat order, according to which Filipchuk would be immediately sent to a position in the clash zone near Volchansk. The orders were to be at the command post established in the region within 3 days. This put Filipchuk in a quick preparation to march with the men to that difficult territory. Still not understanding what was happening, he headed for the ruins. The situation in Volchansk was dire. At 57 years old, Filipchuk had never seen so much destruction and was not prepared for combat at that level. The horror began early, with the men being hunted by drones. A group of them huddled uselessly near a shack, almost completely destroyed. Those who were inside had some luck, but those outside heard the buzzing of the kamikaze drone's propellers too late, as it exploded above them. Two soldiers tried to cross a street when the drone appeared, dancing between them before choosing its victim. After locking its lens on the human target, it dove at the soldier like a shadow tearing through the air. The comrade tried to interrupt its path with his rifle.
However, fate was already sealed. The explosion that claimed the Russian's life was so powerful that it scattered pieces of his body all over the area. Even his comrades, still alive, ended up with human remains on his uniform. The sight of such horror would never leave him. Filipchuk was among the men who experienced this nightmare, but death came to him in another way.
The explosives rained down on the Russians, dropped by drones.
There were so many falling from above that there was nowhere to run. Filipchuk had just arrived at the position. In 10 minutes, the zero line, he was already a target for the drones.
The fire was burning his flesh. He didn't have the strength to run like the younger ones.
Some, even wounded, managed to get away from the areas where the drone swarms were most active. Even those young men fell along the way, and their friends, in panic, had no chance to help them. Filipchuk fell on a front that, for more than a year, would see no significant changes except in the number of corpses. Many would wonder what a man who worked on nuclear submarines was doing in an assault on a front like that. The answer to the fate of yet another Russian corps would be found in the case files against Colonel Anton Nesherda, who, by the way, still faced rather mild charges. The charges against him under Article 286 of the Russian Federation Penal Code for abuse of power were considered mild, given the seriousness of the facts. Systematic extortion of subordinates, violent beatings, torture, and even homicides. It was found that Nesherda deliberately sent unwanted soldiers to certain death. Despite this, the investigation encountered strong resistance. That was Pavel Nesherda's brother, deputy commander of the 4th German Division, colleague of Segundo I. By him it derives. That he totally sexwidrig. Violence of consistency, nuclear wars, sailing under the waves in submarines that were the pride of his homeland. He ended up looking to the skies to see death poured out before him. By a small instrument that, until a few years ago, was mostly used to film weddings and as a children's toy.